The morning alarm pierced through the recycled air of the dormitory like a blade through silence. Rolled out of his narrow bunk, his feet hitting the cold metal floor of the Galactic Defense Academy with practiced ease. Around him, dozens of alien cadets from across the known galaxy began their daily routines, their various forms creating a symphony of movement and sound that had become familiar over the past 6 months. Stretched his human frame, feeling the satisfying pop of joints that had grown stiff during sleep. At 19 years old, he stood average height by human standards, but among his fellow cadets, he was considered small and unremarkable. The warriors towered over everyone at nearly 3 meters tall, their scaled hide gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The crystalline caught and refracted the illumination into rainbow patterns across the walls. Even the, with their 4 arms and compound eyes, possessed an alien grace that made them natural fighters. And then there was, plain, soft-skinned, apparently fragile human. He pulled on his regulation gray training uniform, the fabric designed to accommodate the diverse physiologies of the Academy's student body. The material stretched and adjusted to fit his human proportions, though it always felt loose around his shoulders and arms. The other species were built for war in ways that seemed obvious to everyone except, apparently, the humans who had somehow earned a place in the Galactic Defense Force. The dining hall buzzed with the morning chatter of 200 cadets from 47 different worlds. Grabbed his tray and moved through the serving line, accepting the standard nutritional paste that could safely feed any known biological system. It tasted like nothing, which was probably for the best considering what some of his classmates considered delicacies. He found his usual spot at a table near the rear of the hall, away from the main clusters of social groups that had formed along species lines. It wasn't that he was unwelcome elsewhere, exactly. The other cadets weren't cruel or deliberately exclusionary. They simply didn't know what to make of him, and honestly didn't blame them. Humans were the species to join the Galactic Defense Force, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. They were considered a curiosity at best, a potential liability at worst. Every other species in the Academy had evolved on worlds that had shaped them into natural warriors, high-gravity planets that built dense muscle and bone, hostile environments that honed reflexes to superhuman levels, predatory ecosystems that rewarded speed, strength, and aggression. Earth, by galactic standards, was a garden world. Mild gravity, abundant resources, and a relatively peaceful evolutionary path that had produced what most alien species considered a soft, adaptable generalist rather than a specialized fighting machine. "Mind if we join you?" The voice belonged to Ka, a Meridian whose blue-tinted skin and 4 eyes marked her as one of the Academy's most promising tactical students. Behind her stood, whose massive frame could barely fit through most doorways, and Jin, one of only 3 other humans in Sierre. "Of course," gestured to the empty seats. "How'd everyone do on yesterday's combat simulation?" Ka's primary eyes focused on him while her secondary pair scanned the room, a habit from her species' evolution on a world filled with aerial predators. Better than expected. The virtual draconian assault fleet was challenging, but predictable once you understood their attack patterns. Grunted his agreement, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Predictable if you have the firepower to exploit their weaknesses. My weapons system scored highest in the engagement." Jin, meanwhile, looked troubled. "I keep getting marked down for unconventional tactics. Apparently, using the asteroid field to mask my ship's thermal signature while I repositioned for flanking attacks was unnecessarily creative, according to Instructor Al." "Unconventional how?" asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Human tactical thinking often confounded their instructors, who had developed strategies based on thousands of years of galactic warfare doctrine. Well, no other species thought to use the environment that way. They said it showed a lack of understanding of proper fleet engagement protocols. Jin stabbed at his nutritional paste with more force than necessary. "Sometimes I think they only accepted humans into the Academy to fill some kind of diversity quota." Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted from the main cluster of tables. Voices raised in what sounded like an argument, though the universal translator made it difficult to distinguish the emotional undertones of different species. The 4 cadets turned to watch as a crowd began forming around 2 figures at the center of the disturbance. One was, whose species had earned respect throughout the galaxy for their combat prowess. Standing nearly as tall as the but built lean and predatory, though were known for their lightning-fast reflexes and aggressive nature. There was a high-gravity death trap where only the strongest survived to reproductive age, and it showed in every line of alien physiology. The other figure was Tommy, a human cadet who had arrived at the academy just 2 months ago as part of the latest intake. Didn't know him well, but from what he'd observed, Tommy was quiet, methodical, and had a habit of asking questions that made their instructors uncomfortable. "What's happening over there?" Ka asked, her secondary eyes still focused on their table while her primary pair tracked the growing crowd. His massive head swiveled toward the disturbance. "Looks like he's challenging the new human. This should be interesting." Felt his stomach drop. Challenges between cadets weren't uncommon, but they rarely ended well for the challenged party when the challenger was. Their species had ritual combat encoded in their DNA, and they didn't understand concepts like holding back or fighting for sport. When it issued a challenge, they fought to win, regardless of the consequences for their opponent. The crowd was growing larger, and could see other cadets placing bets on the outcome. The academy allowed formal challenges as a way for students to resolve disputes and test their skills, but there were supposed to be safety protocols. Instructors present, medical teams on standby, rules of engagement clearly established. This looked like it was happening too fast for any of those protections. "We should alert an instructor," Jin said, starting to rise from his seat. Wait put a hand on his friend's arm. "Look at Tommy." While the crowd shouted and postured with typical aggression, Tommy stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos. His expression was calm, almost serene, and he seemed to be listening to something that no one else could hear. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his breathing appeared slow and controlled. "He doesn't look scared," Ka observed with interest. "He should be," rumbled. "Has never lost a challenge. His species doesn't know how to lose." Found himself studying the human cadet more carefully. There was something in Tommy's posture that reminded him of his grandfather, who had served in Earth's military before first contact. A kind of quiet readiness that spoke of experience beyond his apparent age. The crowd suddenly quieted as his voice rose above the din, his words amplified by the dining hall's acoustics. "You dare question honor, soft skin? Your pathetic species knows nothing of true combat. You are prey animals pretending to be warriors." Tommy's response was so quiet that the universal translators had to strain to pick it up. "I wasn't questioning your honor. I was questioning your tactics during yesterday's simulation. There's a difference." A collective intake of breath rippled through the watching cadets. Direct criticism of another species' combat methods was considered deeply insulting in galactic culture, even if the criticism was tactically sound. His reaction was swift and predictable. His forearms spread wide in the classical challenge posture, his elongated skull tilting forward to display the bony ridges that marked him as a mature warrior. "Then, prove your words have meaning, human. Face me in single combat and show these witnesses whether your kind deserves to share the same academy as true fighters." The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence, could feel the tension radiating from every table in the dining hall. This was no longer a simple argument between cadets. It had become a test of whether humans belonged among the galactic military elite. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes closed as if he was calculating something in his head. When he opened them, his voice carried clearly across the sudden silence. "I accept your challenge of the third house. Single combat, academy rules, witnessed assembly." The crowd exploded into excited chatter. Cadets began pushing tables aside to create an improvised fighting circle, while others rushed to inform instructors about the formal challenge. Noticed that betting was becoming more intense, with odds running heavily in his favor. "This is insane," Jin muttered. "Tommy's been here 2 months, has been training for combat since he could walk." "Maybe," replied, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than anyone realized. "But look at the way he's moving." As the space cleared and the two fighters took their positions, observed something that made him reconsider his initial assessment. Tommy's movements were economical and precise, with none of the wasted energy that marked inexperienced fighters. He tested his footing, checked the lighting, and positioned himself with clear intention rather than random nervousness. By contrast, was performing for the crowd. He flexed his forearms in sequence, demonstrated his reach advantage, and issued a series of ritual war cries that were designed to intimidate opponents before combat began. It was impressive, aggressive, and entirely predictable. Instructor Al arrived just as the two cadets completed their pre-combat preparations. The officer was one of the Academy's most experienced combat trainers, and his presence meant that the challenge would proceed under official oversight. He surveyed the improvised arena with 3 of his 6 eyes, while the other 3 tracked potential hazards in the surrounding area. Cadets, and you have issued and accepted a formal challenge under Academy regulations. The engagement will continue until one party yields, is rendered unconscious, or is judged unable to continue by medical assessment. Are these terms understood? Both fighters signaled their agreement, though in very different ways. Roared his acceptance in the traditional manner, his voice echoing off the metal walls and ceiling. Tommy simply nodded once, his expression unchanged from the calm focus he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Begin combat. What happened next would be discussed in Academy corridors for years to come. Launched himself forward with the explosive speed that made feared throughout the galaxy. His 4 arms moved in a complex attack pattern designed to overwhelm his opponent with simultaneous strikes from multiple angles. It was a technique that had allowed his species to dominate there and earn respect among the galactic community's premier fighting races. For exactly 2.7 seconds, it looked like the fight would end as everyone expected. Then Tommy moved. Later analysis would show that the human cadet had done something that violated every principle of combat doctrine taught at the Academy. Instead of trying to block or evade's attack, he had stepped directly into it, closing distance at the exact moment when the momentum was greatest and his ability to change direction was most limited. Tommy's left hand caught S's lead arm at the wrist, not to stop the strike, but to redirect its energy in a way that pulled the alien fighter off balance. His right hand moved in a short, precise arc that connected with a specific point on this elongated skull, just behind the primary sensory cluster. The effect was instantaneous. Legs buckled, his coordination vanished, and he collapsed to the floor in an unconscious heap before his other 3 arms could complete their attack sequence. Total elapsed time, 3.2 seconds. The dining hall fell into complete silence. 200 cadets from dozens of different worlds stared in shock at the impossible scene before them. The most feared fighter in their year, a representative of one of the galaxy's premier warrior species, lay motionless on the floor. Standing over him was a human cadet who didn't even appear to be breathing hard. Instructor Al was the first to react, rushing forward to check on the unconscious while simultaneously signaling for medical assistance. His examination was swift but thorough, and when he stood, his expression was unreadable. Cadet has suffered a temporary neural disruption but shows no signs of permanent damage. He will recover fully within a few hours. The instructor's 6 eyes focused on Tommy with new interest. Cadet, report to my office after medical clearance. We need to discuss your combat training background. As medical teams arrived and began attending to, the crowd of spectators slowly dispersed. Conversations were muted and confused, with cadets struggling to process what they had witnessed. Noticed that the betting activity had stopped entirely, with no one quite sure how to settle the wagers. Tommy remained in place until the medical team finished their work, then approached the unconscious. He knelt beside the stretcher and spoke quietly to the attending physician, asking about recovery time and potential aftereffects. His concern seemed genuine, without any trace of the arrogance that typically followed such a decisive victory. When Tommy finally stood and turned toward the exit, he found and his friends waiting nearby. The human cadet paused, clearly uncertain about their intentions. That was impressive, Ka said simply. I've never seen anyone move that fast. Tommy shrugged, the gesture somehow modest despite what had just occurred. Is an excellent fighter, but he relies too heavily on intimidation. Once you get past the fear factor, combat techniques have some predictable weaknesses. Where did you learn to fight like that? Jin asked. That wasn't standard human military doctrine. For a moment, Tommy's carefully controlled expression slipped, revealing something that looked like old pain mixed with pride. My grandmother was military, special operations. She believed that humans might need to defend themselves in ways that other species wouldn't expect. He started to leave, then paused and looked back at the group. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you advantages, as long as you're smart enough to use them properly. As Tommy walked away, found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about humans and their place in the galactic community. The easy assumptions about Earth being a garden world and humans being soft generalists suddenly seemed less like fact and more like comfortable fiction. The truth, he was beginning to suspect, might be far more complicated and infinitely more interesting. Around them, the dining hall slowly returned to normal activity, but the conversations were different now. Cadets who had dismissed humans as curiosities were asking new questions. Instructors who had considered Earth's children a diversity experiment were scheduling training assessments. And somewhere in the Academy's medical bay, a warrior was learning that word of the 3-second fight spread through the Galactic Defense Academy like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, every cadet, instructor, and staff member knew the story, though the details grew more elaborate with each telling. Some versions had Tommy defeating multiple opponents. Others claimed he had used some kind of human technology. A few suggested that it had been poisoned before the fight. Knew better, he had watched the entire encounter from beginning to end, and what he had seen was pure skill backed by knowledge that no one had expected a human to possess. The next morning brought unexpected changes to the Academy routine. Instead of the usual tactical briefings and combat simulations, all cadets were ordered to report to the main auditorium for what the announcement termed Comprehensive Species Assessment Protocols. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but everyone understood what it really meant. The human species was about to be. Found himself sitting in the second row of the massive amphitheater, surrounded by cadets whose expressions ranged from curiosity to concern to barely concealed excitement. The mood was electric with anticipation, as if the entire academy had suddenly realized they might be sharing classrooms with something they didn't understand. Admiral took the stage with the measured pace that marked him as both a politician and a military leader. This crystalline form caught the auditorium's lighting and scattered it into patterns that helped establish his authority over the diverse collection of species in the audience. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of decades spent managing the galaxy's most complex military organization. Cadets of the Galactic Defense Academy, yesterday's events have prompted a review of our assessment procedures and training protocols. While individual combat prowess has always been valued, we have perhaps placed insufficient emphasis on understanding the unique capabilities that each species brings to our collective defense. Notice that the Admiral's primary attention seemed focused on the small cluster of human cadets scattered throughout the audience. There were only 12 of them in the entire academy, representatives of a species that had been allocated minimal slots due to their perceived limitations. Effective immediately, all cadets will participate in expanded evaluation exercises designed to better understand the full spectrum of each species' military potential. These assessments will be comprehensive, covering not only physical capabilities but tactical innovation, stress response, and adaptive problem-solving under combat conditions. The announcement continued with detailed schedules and procedure explanations, but found his attention drifting to the reactions around him. Many of the alien cadets seemed pleased by the prospect of demonstrating their species' superiority in formal testing. Others looked worried, as if they suspected the assessments might reveal weaknesses they had managed to hide. The human cadets, meanwhile, appeared thoughtful rather than concerned. Realized that they were probably thinking the same thing he was. If yesterday had been any indication, these new tests might produce some very surprising results. After the assembly, made his way to the tactical analysis lab, where he had a scheduled study session with his xenobiology group. The lab was one of his favorite places in the academy, filled with holographic displays and simulation equipment that allowed cadets to examine historical battles from every conceivable angle. He arrived to find the space already occupied by an unusual gathering. Tommy stood at the central display console, surrounded by a mix of cadets and junior instructors who were watching him manipulate a complex tactical scenario. The hologram showed a three-dimensional representation of the Battle of Station, a famous engagement where a small Federation force had held off a much larger hegemony fleet. The conventional analysis focuses on the defensive advantages of the station's position, Tommy was saying, his fingers dancing across the control interface to highlight different elements of the battle. But look at what happens if you track the timing of the Federation's ammunition expenditure. The display shifted, showing ammunition consumption rates for each defending ship. Could see patterns emerging that weren't immediately obvious from the raw tactical data. They weren't just conserving ammo, one of the watching cadets observed. They were coordinating their fire patterns to create gaps in their defensive coverage. Exactly, Tommy confirmed. Deliberate gaps that appeared random but were actually designed to channel the attacking forces into kill zones. The Federation commanders were using their apparent weakness as a tactical weapon. Instructor N, who taught advanced strategy, leaned forward with obvious interest. This interpretation suggests a level of deception that contradicts every analysis in our tactical databases. The Federation forces were considered desperate and disorganized during this engagement. Maybe they wanted to appear desperate and disorganized, Tommy replied quietly. Sometimes the best strategy is to make your enemy think they understand your situation better than they actually do. Found himself studying the battle display with new eyes. The patterns Tommy had identified were subtle but undeniable once you knew what to look for. The Federation forces hadn't just won through luck or superior firepower. They had deliberately manipulated their enemy's perceptions and used those manipulations to create tactical advantages. "Where did you learn to analyze battles this way?" Ann asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment and caught the same expression he had seen in the dining hall the day before. Old pain mixed with pride, as if memories were surfacing that weren't entirely welcome. "My grandmother used to say that every species develops military doctrine based on their own psychology. If you understand how your enemy thinks, you can predict how they'll react to different situations. And if you can predict their reactions, you can shape those reactions to serve your purposes." "Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable strategist," and commented. "She was special operations," Tommy said simply. "Her specialty was asymmetric warfare against superior forces." The phrase hung in the air like a revelation. Asymmetric warfare was a concept that most galactic military doctrine considered obsolete, a relic from primitive civilizations that lacked the technology and organization for proper fleet engagement. The idea that humans might have refined it into a sophisticated strategic art was unsettling to many of the alien species represented in the room. Realized he was witnessing something important. Not just a tactical analysis session, but a fundamental shift in how the Academy's instructors were beginning to view human capabilities. The questions being asked were different now, focused on understanding rather than dismissal. The study session continued for another hour, with Tommy walking the group through several other historical battles and demonstrating analytical techniques that revealed hidden patterns in seemingly straightforward engagements. Each example showed human strategic thinking at work, even in battles where humans hadn't been present. "The key," Tommy explained as the session wound down, "is to remember that every strength can become a weakness if you rely on it too heavily, and every weakness can become a strength if you're creative enough to use it properly." As the group dispersed, lingered behind. Something about Tommy's analyses bothered him, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. The insights were brilliant and the tactical principles were sound, but there was an underlying assumption that made him uncomfortable. "Tommy," he called out as the other cadet prepared to leave, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "All of these examples you've been showing us, they're based on the idea that humans are naturally weaker than their opponents. That we have to win through deception and misdirection because we can't match other species in direct confrontation." Tommy nodded slowly. "That's generally been true throughout human history. We've rarely been the biggest, strongest, or fastest predators in our environment." "But is it still true?" pressed. "I mean, yesterday you took down in 3 seconds. That didn't look like weakness to me." For a moment, Tommy's carefully controlled expression shifted, revealing something that looked almost like sadness. Physical capability is only part of the equation. The real question is whether we can survive in a galaxy where every other major species has evolutionary advantages we lack. What if we have advantages they lack? "Like what?" Gestured toward the now empty tactical display. "Like the ability to see patterns that others miss, to think in ways that other species find unpredictable, to adapt and improvise when standard doctrine fails." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something distant. My grandmother used to tell me stories about Earth's military history, about humans facing impossible odds and finding ways to win anyway. She said our greatest strength wasn't our technology or our courage. It was our refusal to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. Sounds like she was preparing you for something. She was preparing me for this, Tommy gestured around the academy. For a galaxy where humans might be seen as curiosities or weaklings or potential threats, depending on how well we proved ourselves. Felt pieces of understanding clicking into place. That's why you were so calm during the challenge with. You weren't worried about winning or losing. You were focused on making a statement. Every interaction between humans and other species is a statement about what our people are capable of, Tommy confirmed. The question is whether we're making statements we can live with. Before could respond, an announcement echoed through the Academy's communication system. All cadets were to report to their assigned evaluation stations immediately. The comprehensive species assessments were beginning ahead of schedule. As they walked toward the testing areas, found himself thinking about the conversations he'd had over the past 2 days. The easy assumptions about human limitations were crumbling, replaced by questions that no one seemed prepared to answer. The evaluation stations were arranged in the Academy's largest gymnasium, with each testing area designed to accommodate different species' physiological requirements. Was directed to Station 7, where he found himself part of a mixed group that included Ka, and 2 cadets he didn't recognize from species he couldn't immediately identify. The test administrator was Commander Al, a draconian whose reptilian heritage made her appear perpetually annoyed with everything around her. She held a data tablet that contained assessment protocols for each species represented in the group. This evaluation will consist of multiple components designed to assess your tactical thinking, physical capabilities, stress response, and adaptive problem-solving skills, she announced. Each test is tailored to challenge you beyond your expected performance parameters. The first assessment was a physical endurance challenge that required cadets to navigate an obstacle course while carrying species-appropriate loads. Watched as his alien classmates tackled the course with the natural advantages their evolution had provided. Ka's 4 eyes gave her perfect spatial awareness. His massive strength made the weight requirements trivial. The 2 unknown cadets demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost superhuman by Earth standards. When's turn came, he approached the course with the same methodical assessment he had observed in Tommy the day before. The obstacles were designed to test human limitations, but they had been designed by aliens who didn't necessarily understand what those limitations actually were. Instead of trying to match his classmates' natural advantages, focused on efficiency and technique. Where it powered through barriers with brute force, found routes that required less energy expenditure. Where Ka had used her superior vision to plan optimal paths, relied on pattern recognition to identify shortcuts that the course designers hadn't intended. His final time was competitive rather than dominant, but Commander Al made notes on her tablet that suggested his approach had been unexpected. The second assessment was a tactical simulation that placed each cadet in command of a small fleet facing an overwhelming enemy force. Watched as his classmates applied the standard doctrinal approaches their species had developed over centuries of warfare. Their solutions were competent and followed established strategic principles. When his turn came, found himself thinking about Tommy's analysis of historical battles. The simulation was designed to be unwinnable using conventional tactics, which meant the real test was probably creativity rather than tactical knowledge. He began by appearing to follow standard human fleet doctrine, positioning his ships in defensive formations that looked appropriately desperate. But as the enemy closed distance, he implemented a series of maneuvers that were designed to look like mistakes while actually creating the conditions for a coordinated counterattack. The simulation enemy reacted exactly as it hoped, pressing their apparent advantage in ways that exposed them to concentrated fire from positions they had ignored. The battle ended with the attacking force destroyed and its fleet largely intact. Commander Al's expression was unreadable, but noticed that she spent considerably more time entering data about his performance than she had for the other cadets. The third assessment was the most challenging. Each cadet was placed in a high-stress scenario designed to push them beyond their psychological comfort zones. The goal was to observe how different species responded when their normal coping mechanisms failed. found himself in a simulation of a ship disaster, with failing life support, injured crew members, and multiple critical systems requiring immediate attention. The scenario was designed to create decision paralysis by presenting more urgent problems than any single individual could possibly solve. His classmates had approached the challenge in ways that reflected their species' natural responses to crisis. Ka had attempted to coordinate multiple simultaneous solutions, had focused on the single most critical problem, and applied maximum effort to solving it. The other cadets had demonstrated species-specific adaptations that were impressive but predictable. Took a different approach. Instead of trying to solve all the problems himself, he began improvising solutions that turned the crisis into an opportunity for distributed problem-solving. He rigged damaged systems to fail in ways that would alert other crew members to specific problems. He used the ship's communication system to turn panicked personnel into an organized response team. He even deliberately caused a minor secondary crisis that forced the simulation's automated systems to implement emergency protocols he couldn't access directly. By the end of the scenario, the crisis had been resolved not through individual heroism, but through a complex web of improvised cooperation that had emerged from apparent chaos. Commander Al was no longer trying to hide her interest. "Cadet, where did you learn those emergency management techniques?" "I didn't," replied honestly. "I just tried to figure out what would happen if I treated the crisis as a resource instead of a problem." The assessment continued with 2 more challenges, each designed to test capabilities that had never been formally evaluated in human cadets. By the time the session ended, felt mentally exhausted but oddly optimistic. Whatever the results showed, he was confident that they wouldn't match anyone's expectations. As the cadets filed out of the gymnasium, noticed that conversations between species were different than they had been that morning. There was less casual dismissal and more genuine curiosity. The evaluations had apparently produced some surprising data. That evening, the dining hall buzzed with speculation about test results and what they might mean for Academy policies. Sat with his usual group, but the table had expanded to include several cadets who had never shown interest in human perspectives before. "Did you hear about the tactical simulation results?" Jin asked as he joined them with his dinner tray. Apparently 3 different human cadets found solutions that weren't in the instructor's answer database. "What kind of solutions?" Ka inquired. "The kind that work but don't follow any recognized strategic doctrine," Jin replied. "According to my roommate, the evaluation committee is scheduling additional assessments to figure out whether we got lucky or whether there's something systematic they need to understand." Exchanged glances with Tommy, who had arrived late and taken a seat at the edge of their expanded group. The quiet cadet's expression suggested he had expected something like this to happen. "How long do you think it'll take them to figure it out?" asked. "Figure out what?" rumbled. Tommy answered before could respond. "That humans aren't just another species with standard military capabilities. We're something different, and different means unpredictable." "Different how?" one of the new cadets asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Most species develop military doctrine based on maximizing their natural advantages. Humans develop military doctrine based on surviving encounters with opponents who have natural advantages we lack." "That doesn't sound like an advantage," Ka observed. "It is if you're facing opponents who assume you'll fight the way your species is supposed to fight," Tommy replied. "Predictability is a tactical weakness, even when it's based on superior capabilities." Around the table, alien cadets began asking questions about human military history and Earth's evolutionary pressures. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics that had never been discussed in mixed species groups before. As finally prepared to leave for his dormitory, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in the Academy's social dynamics. Humans were no longer curiosities or potential liabilities. They had become a puzzle that needed to be solved, and puzzles were always interesting to military minds. The evaluation results were released at 800 hours with the clinical precision that marked all official Academy communications. Read through his personal assessment 3 times before the implications fully registered. According to the detailed analysis, his performance had exceeded expected parameters in every category except raw physical capability, and even there his efficiency ratings had been rated as exceptional for species baseline. More interesting than his individual scores were the aggregate statistics for human cadets. As a group, they had demonstrated tactical innovation indices that ranked in the 97th percentile across all tested species. Their stress response profiles showed unusual resilience to complex multivariable crisis scenarios. Most significantly, their problem-solving approaches had required the evaluation committee to create entirely new classification categories. The official summary was carefully neutral, but could read between the diplomatic language. The Academy's xenobiology and tactical departments were struggling to understand what they had discovered about human capabilities. Unofficial rumors were spreading through every corridor and common area. Some claimed that humans had been deliberately hiding their true abilities. Others suggested that Earth's military had developed training methods that surpassed galactic standards. A few whispered that the evaluation equipment might have malfunctioned when testing human subjects. Was reviewing stellar cartography data in the Academy's main library when Instructor Al approached his study carrel. The 6 eyes tracked multiple environmental factors simultaneously, a habit that made conversations with him feel like tactical briefings. Cadet, you are requested to report to Admiral's office at 1400 hours. Bring your complete academic records and any personal documentation relating to your pre-academy education. The instruction was delivered with neutral professionalism, but caught the undertones that suggested this was not a routine administrative meeting. May I ask what this concerns, sir? The Admiral is conducting personal interviews with selected cadets following yesterday's assessments. Your presence has been specifically requested. Al paused, his primary eyes focusing directly on while the others continued their environmental scan. I suggest you prepare to answer detailed questions about your background and training. As the instructor moved away, felt a mixture of anticipation and concern. Being selected for personal attention from the Academy's commanding officer could be either an honor or a warning, depending on what the evaluation results had revealed. He spent the remaining hours before his appointment gathering the requested documentation and trying to anticipate what questions he might face. His pre-academy education had been typical for a human cadet. Standard planetary schooling, basic military preparation, and the intensive cultural orientation required for all species entering the galactic community. There was nothing in his background that should have warranted special attention, which made the Admiral's interest even more puzzling. Admiral's office occupied the highest level of the Academy's command tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a panoramic view of the training complex and the star field beyond. The officer was studying a holographic display when entered, his crystalline form refracting the afternoon light into patterns that shifted with his movements. Cadet, thank you for coming. Please sit. The Admiral gestured toward a chair that had been positioned to face his desk directly. I've been reviewing your evaluation results, and I have some questions about your performance. Settled into the indicated seat and arranged his documentation on his lap. Of course, sir. I'm happy to clarify anything about my assessment. Your tactical simulation results are particularly interesting, Admiral began, manipulating the holographic display to show a three-dimensional replay of fleet engagement. You achieved victory through a combination of deception, misdirection, and improvised coordination that our analysis team had difficulty categorizing. The replay showed simulated battle from multiple angles, with tactical annotations highlighting decision points that had deviated from standard doctrine. Watching his own performance from an outside perspective could see patterns that he hadn't consciously recognized during the actual test. The solution you implemented required you to predict your opponent's psychological responses with remarkable accuracy, the Admiral continued. This suggests either exceptional intuitive capabilities or training in psychological warfare techniques that exceed our expectations for cadet-level education. Considered his response carefully. I wasn't trying to implement any specific doctrine, sir. I just tried to think about what the simulation enemy expected me to do and then do something different. Something different that happened to exploit precisely the right tactical assumptions to achieve optimal results, Admiral observed. Cadet, random improvisation doesn't produce the kind of performance you demonstrated. Either you possess unusual natural abilities, or you've received training that isn't reflected in your official records. The question hung in the air with the weight of official inquiry. Realized that his honest answer might have implications beyond his individual situation, potentially affecting how the entire human species was viewed by galactic military leadership. Sir, I think the difference might be in how humans approach tactical problems. Most of the strategic doctrine I've studied assumes that opponents will fight according to recognized patterns. But humans learned to fight in an environment where opponents didn't follow any rules we could predict. Admiral leaned forward with obvious interest. Elaborate. Earth's evolutionary history didn't produce specialized warrior castes or natural combat adaptations, explained. Instead, it produced generalists who survived by being able to adapt to any threat they encountered. When humans developed military doctrine, we had to assume that our opponents would be stronger, faster, and better equipped than we were. And this shaped your tactical thinking how? Gestured toward the holographic replay. We learned to treat every engagement as an asymmetric scenario where conventional approaches would fail. The goal wasn't to match enemy capabilities, but to create situations where those capabilities became disadvantages. The Admiral manipulated the display to highlight specific moments in the battle. You're suggesting that what appeared to be intuitive tactical innovation was actually the application of systematic strategic principles. I'm suggesting that human strategic principles might be different from what other species consider normal, replied. We've spent thousands of years assuming we would be the underdogs in any serious conflict. Admiral was quiet for a long moment, his crystalline form shifting through subtle color changes that had learned indicated deep thought in psychology. When he spoke again, his voice carried new undertones of consideration. Cadet, I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question, and I want you to answer based on your assessment of human capabilities rather than diplomatic politeness. Yes, sir. If humanity were to face a military threat from a technologically superior opponent with overwhelming numerical advantages, how would your species approach the conflict? The question struck as far more significant than a theoretical exercise. The Admiral's tone suggested he was seeking information that would influence real strategic planning. Humans would probably start by studying the enemy's psychology and strategic assumptions, said slowly. We'd look for ways to turn their advantages against them, create situations where their superior technology became a liability rather than an asset. Specific examples. Found himself thinking about the historical references Tommy had mentioned, stories his own family had shared about Earth's military past. We'd probably use mobility and unpredictability to avoid direct confrontation while targeting supply lines and command structures. We'd try to make the conflict too expensive to continue rather than trying to win through superior firepower. And if conventional asymmetric approaches failed, then we'd probably try unconventional asymmetric approaches, replied. Humans have a tendency to treat impossible situations as engineering problems rather than military defeats. Admiral made notes on a personal data pad, his movements precise and deliberate. One final question, Cadet. Do you believe that human tactical capabilities represent a significant strategic asset for the Galactic Defense Force? Hesitated, recognizing that his answer could have far-reaching consequences for human integration into the galactic military structure. I think human tactical capabilities complement the strengths that other species bring to the Defense Force. We might be particularly valuable in scenarios where conventional doctrine proves insufficient. Thank you, Cadet. You may return to your regular schedule. The Admiral's tone was formally dismissive, but caught subtleties that suggested the conversation had been more significant than its brevity implied. As left the command tower, he encountered Tommy waiting in the reception area outside the Admiral's office. The quiet cadet looked up from a data pad he had been studying, his expression thoughtful. How did it go? Tommy asked quietly. I think I just participated in a strategic assessment, replied. They're trying to figure out what humans are actually capable of. Good, it's about time. Before could ask what he meant, Tommy was called into the Admiral's office, leaving him to wonder about the larger implications of the day's events. That evening, the dining hall conversations were dominated by speculation about individual meetings with Academy leadership. At least 6 human cadets had been called for personal interviews, and rumors suggested that similar sessions were being conducted with representatives from other species as well. They're recalibrating, Jin observed as their usual group gathered for dinner. The evaluation results didn't match their baseline assumptions about human capabilities. Recalibrating toward what? Ka asked. Tommy, who had rejoined them after his own meeting with the Admiral, considered the question carefully. Toward understanding that humans might be tactically useful in ways they hadn't considered. Is that good or bad? Rumbled. It's realistic, Tommy replied. The question is whether the Galactic Defense Force is ready to integrate tactical approaches that don't match their existing doctrine. Found himself studying the faces around the table, noting expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern to barely concealed excitement. The conversation was different from anything they had shared before, focused on strategic implications rather than social dynamics. What happens if they decide human tactics are too unconventional to integrate? One of the newer cadets asked. Then they miss opportunities, Tommy said simply. And in a galaxy where threats can emerge from anywhere, missing opportunities can be fatal. The conversation continued late into the evening, but noticed that it had attracted attention from other tables. Cadets from multiple species were listening to human perspectives with the kind of focused interest that suggested professional rather than social curiosity. As the group finally dispersed toward their dormitories, realized that the Academy's social dynamics had shifted again. Humans were no longer being evaluated as individuals who happened to belong to an unusual species. They were being assessed as representatives of a tactical philosophy that might have strategic value. The distinction was subtle but important, because it meant that human cadets were now being viewed as potential military assets rather than curious anomalies. Walking through the Academy's corridors, could feel the weight of that new attention. Conversations quieted as he passed, then resumed with undertones that suggested his presence had become a topic of professional interest. In his dormitory room, reviewed his personal notes from the day's events, and tried to understand the larger pattern that was emerging. The evaluation results had revealed capabilities that Academy leadership hadn't expected. The personal interviews were gathering information about human strategic thinking. The changes in social dynamics suggested that perceptions were shifting at institutional levels. Something significant was happening, and suspected that tomorrow would bring new developments that would further transform the human species' role in galactic military culture. As he prepared for sleep, found himself thinking about Tommy's grandmother and her stories about human military history. If she had been preparing her grandson for interactions with alien military leadership, she had apparently understood something about humanity's galactic future, that the changes began subtly. Noticed them first in the way instructors addressed human cadets during tactical briefings, with questions that probed deeper into reasoning processes and alternative approaches. What had previously been polite acknowledgement of diversity was becoming genuine professional interest in human strategic perspectives. 3 days after the evaluation results were released, Admiral announced a new training program that would integrate species-specific tactical methodologies into the Academy's standard curriculum. The announcement was carefully neutral, but everyone understood that it was primarily about studying and potentially implementing human military approaches. Found himself assigned to Advanced Strategic Analysis, a course that had previously been restricted to final-year cadets with exceptional academic standing. When he arrived at the designated classroom, he discovered that all 12 human cadets in his year had received the same assignment, along with a carefully selected group of alien students who represented their species' top tactical minds. The instructor was Commander, a draconian whose reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by her reputation for intellectual ruthlessness. She had never shown particular interest in human cadets before, which made her current focused attention both flattering and slightly intimidating. This course will examine tactical scenarios where conventional military doctrine has proven insufficient, she announced as the mixed species class settled into their seats. We will analyze historical engagements, theoretical war games, and simulated crisis situations that require innovative solutions rather than standard responses. She activated the classroom's central holographic display, which filled with a three-dimensional representation of a star system under siege. The tactical situation was complex, involving multiple enemy fleets, civilian population centers, and resource limitations that made conventional defensive strategies impossible. Your first assignment is to develop strategic recommendations for this scenario, Commander continued. You will work in mixed species teams, with each group required to present solutions that integrate different tactical philosophies. Found himself assigned to a team that included Ka, a warrior named Anne, a crystalline called El, and Tommy. The diversity of species and strategic backgrounds was clearly intentional, designed to force interaction between radically different approaches to military problem-solving. As the team gathered around their assigned workstation, could sense the tension that came from mixing incompatible tactical traditions. Anne's heritage emphasized overwhelming force applied at decisive moments. El's background focused on complex coordination between multiple simultaneous operations. Ka's Meridian culture valued methodical analysis and risk minimization. And Tommy represented human strategic thinking, which none of the others fully understood, but all had learned to respect following recent events. The scenario parameters are designed to make standard approaches fail, Ka observed after reviewing the tactical data. No single fleet can match the enemy's firepower, and we don't have time to coordinate a traditional defensive buildup. Then we hit them hard at their most vulnerable point and break their operational coordination, and suggested, his massive frame leaning over the display controls. Doctrine emphasizes decisive engagement when enemy forces are divided. Their forces aren't divided, Elle pointed out, her crystalline form refracting the holographic light into shifting patterns. They're distributed across multiple operational areas, but each element is capable of independent action. Striking one component won't significantly degrade their overall capability. Studied the scenario from multiple angles, noting details that seemed important but didn't fit obvious strategic categories. What if we're thinking about this wrong? Maybe the goal isn't to defeat the enemy fleets directly. What else could the goal be? Anne asked. Making the operation too expensive to continue, Tommy replied quietly. He had been manipulating the display controls to examine supply lines and communication networks that weren't immediately obvious from the primary tactical view. Look at the resource expenditure required to maintain their current operational tempo. The display shifted to show logistical data that had been buried in secondary analysis files. The enemy's impressive fleet strength was supported by supply chains that stretched across multiple star systems, requiring enormous coordination and resource commitment to maintain. They're operating at maximum sustainable capacity, realized. Any increase in operational costs or coordination requirements could force them to scale back or withdraw. Ka's 4 eyes focused on the logistics display with new interest. You're suggesting we target their supply infrastructure rather than their combat forces. I'm suggesting we make their current strategy unsustainable, Tommy corrected. There are multiple ways to do that without necessarily destroying their fleets. The team spent the next several hours developing a strategic approach that none of them could have conceived individually. Instead of trying to match enemy capabilities through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, they designed a campaign focused on disrupting operational assumptions and creating cascading logistical problems. Their solution involved apparent retreats that drew enemy forces into extended supply lines, false intelligence that encouraged overcommitment to secondary objectives, and carefully coordinated strikes against infrastructure targets that would force the enemy to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive consolidation. When they presented their recommendations to the class, noticed that Commander's expression was unreadable but intently focused. The alien instructor asked detailed questions about specific tactical choices and requested clarification about strategic assumptions that weren't immediately obvious from the presentation. Your approach requires the enemy to behave in predictable ways, she observed. What if they recognize the deception and adapt their strategy? Then we adapt faster than they do, Tommy replied simply. The goal isn't to implement a perfect plan. It's to create a dynamic situation where our advantages matter more than theirs. And what advantages do you believe you possess? Found himself answering before he consciously decided to speak. We're better at improvising than they probably expect us to be. Most military doctrine assumes that opponents will follow recognizable strategic patterns, but humans specialize in doing things that don't make sense until after they work. Commander was quiet for a long moment, her reptilian features betraying no emotion. Interesting, Please submit a detailed analysis of your strategic reasoning along with your tactical recommendations. As the class session ended and cadets began filing toward the exit, noticed that conversations between different species were more intense than usual. The tactical exercise had revealed something about human strategic thinking that was making everyone reconsider their assumptions about military capabilities. "That was impressive work," Elle commented as their team gathered their materials. "Your approach required us to think about strategic objectives in ways that wouldn't have occurred to any of our species independently. It required us to think like humans," and rumbled, though his tone suggested respect rather than dismissal. "Your tactical philosophy is more complex than our initial assessments indicated." As they left the classroom, found himself walking alongside Ka, who seemed unusually thoughtful about the day's events. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "When humans develop military strategy, do you always assume that conventional approaches will fail?" Considered the question, remembering conversations with Tommy and fragments of family history that had never seemed particularly relevant before. "I think we assume that whatever advantages we have will be temporary, so we need strategies that work even when our opponents figure out how to counter them." "That's a very different way of thinking about warfare," Ka observed. "Most species develop doctrine based on maximizing their natural strengths and minimizing their weaknesses. You seem to develop doctrine based on the assumption that your strengths will be neutralized." "Maybe that's because human strengths aren't obvious enough to build standard doctrine around," replied. "We had to learn to win through creativity and adaptation rather than superior capability." The conversation continued as they walked toward the dining hall, but noticed that other cadets were listening to their discussion with a kind of focused attention that suggested professional interest rather than casual curiosity. That evening brought new developments that confirmed sense that significant changes were occurring at institutional levels. An announcement from Academy leadership informed all cadets that the training curriculum would be expanded to include integrated tactical methodologies, starting the following week. More significantly, human cadets were being assigned to special projects that would examine historical military engagements where conventional doctrine had failed. The stated goal was to identify strategic principles that might have broader application in contemporary galactic defense scenarios. "They're reverse engineering human tactical thinking," Jin observed as their expanded dinner group discussed the day's events. "Trying to figure out whether our approaches can be systematized and taught to other species." "Is that possible?" asked one of the alien cadets who had become a regular part of their conversations. Tommy was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not sure human tactical thinking can be systematized the way they're hopping. A lot of it depends on being willing to accept uncertainty and improvise solutions when standard approaches fail." "Those are learnable skills," pointed out. "Maybe," Tommy acknowledged, "but they require you to be comfortable with the idea that your initial plan will probably be wrong, and that success will depend on how well you can adapt when things go badly." Found himself studying the faces around the table, noting that the conversation was attracting attention from cadets at neighboring tables. Word of human tactical capabilities had spread throughout the academy, creating interest that went far beyond casual curiosity. "What happens if the Galactic Defense Force decides to integrate human strategic approaches into their standard doctrine?" Ka asked. "Then they become more flexible and harder to predict," Tommy replied. "Which is probably good for galactic security, but might be uncomfortable for military leaders who prefer predictable outcomes." The discussion continued late into the evening, but noticed that the tone had shifted from speculative to practical. These were no longer theoretical conversations about human capabilities. They were strategic planning sessions about how those capabilities might be integrated into galactic military culture. As the group finally dispersed toward their dormitories, realized that the human species had reached a turning point in their relationship with the galactic community. They were no longer being tolerated as curious newcomers or assessed as potential security risks. They were being evaluated as a strategic asset that might change the fundamental nature of galactic military doctrine. Walking through the Academy's corridors, could feel the weight of that transformation in the way other cadets regarded him. The polite indifference that had characterized human-alien interactions was being replaced by professional respect mixed with cautious uncertainty. In his room, reviewed his notes from the day's tactical exercise and tried to understand what his team's success revealed about human strategic thinking. Their solution had worked not because it was inherently superior to alien approaches, but because it had integrated different tactical philosophies in ways that none of the participating species could have achieved independently. The implication was both encouraging and concerning. If human strategic value lay in their ability to synthesize and adapt different approaches rather than in possessing superior capabilities, then their continued value would depend on their ability to understand and work with alien military cultures. But it also suggested that humans might have a unique role to play in galactic defense, serving as strategic innovators who could develop solutions when conventional doctrine proved insufficient. As he prepared for sleep, found himself thinking about the responsibilities that might come with being taken seriously as a military force. The Academy's new interest in human tactical thinking was flattering, but it also carried expectations that could have far-reaching consequences for the final test came without warning, as had learned to expect from Academy training protocols. Emergency klaxons shattered the pre-dawn silence, and cadets throughout the complex scrambled to reach designated muster points within the required time limits. This was different from routine drills, though. The urgency in the automated announcements carried undertones that suggested actual rather than simulated crisis. Reached Assembly Point 7 with seconds to spare, finding himself part of a mixed group that included cadets from his Advanced Strategic Analysis course, along with representatives from every species in his year. Admiral stood at the center of the space, his crystalline form radiating the kind of focused energy that marked genuine emergency situations. Cadets, you are about to participate in a live strategic exercise that will test everything you have learned during your time at the Academy, the Admiral announced. 6 hours ago, long-range sensors detected an unknown fleet entering the sector. The composition and intentions of this fleet are unclear, but their approach vector suggests they may pose a threat to civilian populations on 3 inhabited worlds. Felt his pulse quicken as holographic displays activated around the assembly point, showing real-time tactical data from the threatened star system. This wasn't a simulation or training scenario. Academy cadets were being asked to develop strategic recommendations for an actual military situation. The Galactic Defense Force has assets in the region, but they are insufficient to guarantee protection for all potential targets if hostile intentions are confirmed, Admiral continued. Your assignment is to develop contingency plans for multiple scenarios, ranging from peaceful contact to full-scale military engagement. The cadets were divided into strategic planning teams with the same mixed species composition that had characterized their recent coursework. Found himself once again working with Tommy, Ka, N, and L, but the dynamic was different now. The pressure of working with real consequences had eliminated the casual academic atmosphere that had marked their previous collaboration. Time limit is 4 hours, the Admiral concluded. Your recommendations will be transmitted directly to fleet commanders in the operational area. Choose your strategies carefully. As their team gathered around their assigned tactical display, could see that the scenario parameters were complex enough to challenge any strategic doctrine. The unknown fleet was large enough to overwhelm local defense forces, but small enough to suggest they might be explorers or merchants rather than invaders. Their technology appeared advanced, but not obviously hostile. Most troubling, their communications had been incomprehensible to galactic translation protocols, making diplomatic contact impossible. Standard doctrine would require us to assume hostile intent and position our forces for maximum defensive coverage, Elle observed, her crystalline form reflecting the tactical displays in patterns of shifting light. But that approach leaves us vulnerable to a coordinated assault if they are actually aggressive. And it potentially escalates a peaceful situation into armed conflict, Ka added, her 4 eyes tracking multiple elements of the tactical display simultaneously. Meridian experience suggests that showing too much force can provoke the very aggression you're trying to prevent. And leaned over the controls with typical intensity. If they are hostile, hesitation costs lives. Better to demonstrate strength and force them to reconsider their intentions than to appear weak and encourage attack. Studied the available data, nodding patterns that seemed important but didn't fit obvious strategic categories. The unknown fleet's behavior was methodical rather than aggressive, but their refusal to respond to standard communication protocols was concerning. More puzzling was their choice of approach vector, which seemed unnecessarily complex for either peaceful or hostile intentions. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" he suggested. "Maybe the question isn't whether they're peaceful or hostile. Maybe it's whether they're trying to communicate something we don't understand." Tommy had been quietly manipulating secondary data displays, examining information about stellar phenomena and navigation hazards in the region. "Look at their course changes over the past 6 hours. They're not following the most efficient route to any of the inhabited worlds." The display shifted to show the fleet's actual path through the star system, revealing a series of course corrections that made no sense from either tactical or navigational perspectives, unless they were trying to avoid something that wasn't showing up on galactic sensors. "They're dodging stellar radiation storms," Ka realized, "phenomena that wouldn't affect ships with standard galactic shielding technology. Which means their technology is either much more primitive or much more advanced than ours," added. "Either way, our standard assumptions about their capabilities are probably wrong." The team spent the next hour developing a strategic approach that treated the unknown fleet as a communication problem rather than a military threat. Instead of positioning forces for maximum defensive coverage, they recommended a graduated response protocol that would provide multiple opportunities for peaceful resolution, while maintaining the capability to escalate if hostile intentions became clear. Their solution involved deploying small scout ships to establish communication through mathematical and scientific concepts that should be universal. Meanwhile, the main defense fleet would position itself to provide maximum flexibility rather than maximum firepower, ready to respond to either diplomatic or military developments. Most controversially, they suggested that the unknown fleet's apparent technological differences might make them valuable potential allies rather than threats to be neutralized. "You're recommending that we treat first contact with an unknown species as an opportunity rather than a crisis," Commander observed when their team presented their analysis to the evaluation panel. "We're recommending that we gather information before making irreversible strategic decisions," Tommy replied. "Most of our concerns about this fleet are based on assumptions that might not be accurate. And if your assumptions are wrong and they prove to be hostile," found himself answering before he consciously decided to speak, "then we'll adapt our strategy based on better information. But if we assume they're hostile and we're wrong, we might miss the chance to establish peaceful relations with a species that could become valuable allies." Admiral had been silent throughout the presentations, but his crystalline form had shifted through color patterns that had learned indicated deep consideration in psychology. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that would affect real lives. "Your recommendation emphasizes flexibility and information gathering over predetermined strategic responses," he observed. "This approach requires considerable confidence in your ability to adapt quickly if initial assumptions prove incorrect." "That's what humans specialize in," Tommy said simply. "We're better at improvising than we are at executing perfect plans." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on data displays that showed real-time updates from the sector. Whatever decisions were being made would happen soon, with consequences that could reshape galactic politics. "Cadet teams, your recommendations have been transmitted to fleet commanders in the operational area," he announced finally. "The strategic approach developed by Team 7 has been selected for implementation, with modifications to account for available resources and operational constraints." Felt a mixture of pride and anxiety as he realized that their human influence strategy was about to be tested in actual combat conditions. The weight of responsibility was heavier than anything he had experienced during academic training. "You will monitor the situation from the Academy's Strategic Operations Center," Admiral continued. "Consider this a practical examination of everything you have learned about strategic thinking and tactical implementation." The Operations Center was a massive chamber filled with holographic displays and communication equipment that connected the Academy to military units throughout the galaxy. And his teammates were given observer status at a tactical station where they could follow the implementation of their recommendations in real time. The next 6 hours were in applied strategic thinking under genuine pressure. The scout ships they had recommended succeeded in establishing basic communication with the unknown fleet, confirming that they were indeed explorers from a distant galaxy who had been struggling with navigation problems caused by their unfamiliar technology. The graduated response protocol allowed diplomatic contact to proceed without the kind of military posturing that might have triggered defensive reactions. When the unknown species requested assistance with their navigation systems, the Galactic Defense Force was positioned to provide help rather than having to explain why they had assumed hostile intent. By the end of the day, the crisis had been resolved not through military victory, but through successful first contact with a species whose advanced biotechnology could potentially revolutionize galactic medicine and engineering. Your strategic recommendation prevented what could have been a tragic misunderstanding, Admiral told the assembled cadets as the situation reached successful conclusion. More importantly, it demonstrated strategic principles that may have broader application in future scenarios where conventional military doctrine proves insufficient. As the debriefing session concluded, and cadets began dispersing toward their dormitories, realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of human capabilities and galactic responsibilities. The 3-second fight that had started everything seemed like ancient history now. What had begun as a simple demonstration of individual combat skill had evolved into recognition that humans might have strategic value that went far beyond their personal fighting abilities. So what happens now? Jin asked as their expanded group gathered for what had become their traditional post-crisis discussion session. Now we prove that today wasn't a fluke, Tommy replied. The Academy is going to integrate human strategic approaches into their training curriculum, which means we'll be expected to help develop doctrine for scenarios where conventional military thinking isn't sufficient. That's a lot of responsibility, Ka observed. It's the kind of responsibility that humans are good at handling, said, thinking about the day's events and their larger implications for his species' future in the galactic community. Around the table, alien cadets who had become friends and colleagues nodded their agreement. The conversations that followed covered topics that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier: integrated tactical doctrine, cross-species strategic training, and the development of military approaches that could adapt to threats that hadn't been encountered before. As the evening wound down and the group finally dispersed, found himself walking through academy corridors that felt different than they had that morning. The human species had proven themselves worthy of strategic responsibility, and with that recognition came opportunities and obligations that would shape their galactic future. In his room, reviewed the day's events, and tried to understand the larger pattern that had emerged from the Academy's transformation. What had started as a simple assessment of human combat capabilities had revealed strategic thinking that could complement and enhance the military doctrine of the entire galactic community. The implications were both encouraging and sobering. Humans had earned respect and responsibility, but they had also accepted obligations that would require them to continue proving themselves worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. As he prepared for sleep, found himself thinking about Tommy's grandmother and her stories about human military history. Her preparation of her grandson for interactions with alien military leadership had apparently been based on understanding that humans would eventually need to demonstrate their strategic value to a galactic community that initially saw them as curiosities. That demonstration was now complete, but the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as humans took their place among the strategic leaders of galactic civilization. The 3-second fight that had announced human capabilities was becoming a foundation for strategic influence that could last for generations, and felt confident that his species was ready for the responsibilities that came with being taken seriously as a military force in an uncertain galaxy future in the galactic community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but felt confident that humans were ready to prove themselves worthy of the trust that was slowly being placed in them others were only beginning to recognize. The question was whether humans were ready for the responsibilities that might come with being taken seriously as a military force. The evaluation results would be announced tomorrow, but suspected the real test had already begun. The question was whether humans were ready for the kind of attention they were about to receive. D'Atre were things in the galaxy that even his people's legendary combat heritage hadn't prepared him for. The human species had just announced their presence in a way that no one would forget.